All right, so today we're diving into something pretty unique in the world of acupuncture. We're going to be talking about Tung's acupuncture. And if you've ever come across traditional Chinese medicine, yeah, this is something else. This is different. We're going to be using the practical atlas of Tung's acupuncture by Henry McCann and Hans Georg Ross. And this atlas is it's really kind of its own thing. It's not just another variation. It's got its own points and its own therapeutic strategies.
Yeah, absolutely. And this atlas is actually in its 5th edition now. It was first published in 2012, so it's become a really valuable resource for practitioners who are, really wanting to get into this powerful system. But it's important to keep in mind, as the book emphasizes, that the information is for, research and scholarly purposes and not a substitute for professional advice from, a medical professional.
Yeah, for sure.
But for, exploring this today, I think it gives us a great glimpse into a really compelling path to healing.
Yeah. And so the goal for us today is to kind of unlock this fundamental part of Tung's acupuncture, which is how practitioners actually select their points, specifically this idea of correspondence. So we're talking about how needling seemingly unrelated areas of the body can actually be used to target, very specific health issues. It's a really interesting part of this system. So maybe to get us started, what's the core thinking that goes into how these points are actually chosen in Tung's acupuncture?
Well, I think we have to start with the foundation, the theory behind it. So Tung's acupuncture works on this principle that the body is a whole, it's interconnected. And so how points are selected is largely based on 3 key systems of correspondence. And those are image correspondence, channel correspondence, and tissue correspondence.
Correct.
So these systems are kind of like a framework to understand how different parts of the body relate to each other and how you can use points to kind of influence areas that might be experiencing disease or imbalance.
That's really interesting. Image correspondence. That one really sticks out to me. What is that exactly?
Yeah. So image correspondence is basically this therapeutic principle where you treat a body part by using a point that resembles it. And that could be in terms of shape, size, even function.
Oh.
So, the concept behind that is actually very old. This idea that the body is a microcosm reflecting the macrocosm. So there's this inherent interconnectedness at all levels.
So if you have a problem in one area, you treat like a mirrored area somewhere else.
Yeah, that's one way to think about it. And figure T1 in the atlas actually shows this really nicely. So it outlines 3 types of image correspondence. So first, you can treat a diseased body area by using a corresponding therapeutic body area. So, think about treating a knee pain by using a point on the elbow, given their similar, joint structures. And then second, you can address a diseased channel by using a therapeutic channel. So that's using points on a meridian that corresponds to the one that's affected. And then third, you can treat diseased tissue by targeting therapeutic tissue. So that means you're using a point that affects similar tissue in a different location. So the effect kind of radiates out. It influences the part that's diseased through those correspondences.
That makes sense to me. But you mentioned this concept of inversion as well. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so inversion is really interesting. It's kind of a twist on image correspondence. So it's where the orientation of the correspondence is actually reversed. So instead of mirroring directly, you might treat the lower leg by needling a point on the uppy arm, for example. It's like looking at a reflection, but upside down. It's really quite fascinating.
Yeah. Okay, so starting to picture these connections, can we give some specific examples of how this actually looks in the body? I know the atlas refers to different taijis. Can you explain that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the atlas describes large taiji, medium taiji, and small taiji, and each of those represents different scales of body correspondence. So let's start with large taiji. And figure T3 illustrates this one. So this is all about overall body correspondence. And the concept of taiji itself really represents interconnectedness, wholeness of the universe, which is reflected in the body on these different scales. So in the normal orientation of large taiji, the head and trunk of the body actually correspond to the extremities. So the head, for example, would have a correspondence in both the hand and the foot. And then similarly, the plane of the knee, navel and elbow, corresponds to the wrist and ankle plane. And then when you look at the inverted orientation, those relationships are flipped. So the foot would then correspond to the head and the upper arm to the lower leg.
So like a practitioner could choose a point on the hand to treat an issue on the head or even the foot if they're using inversion.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's wild.
So the moving to medium taiji, which is shown in figure T4, this focuses on the correspondence between the head and trunk and then the forearm and lower leg.
So normally the head corresponds to the forearm and the abdomen would correspond to the thigh. The hand corresponds to the foot and the fingers to the toes. And again, just like with large taiji, there's an inverted version where all those correspondences are flipped. So, for example, the forearm might represent the lower trunk.
Okay, so with medium taiji, we're kind of zooming in a bit closer. So what about small taiji?
Yeah. So small taiji, which is figure T5, takes an even more localized look.
Okay.
So it looks at the correspondence between the trunk and head and the part of the arm and leg below the ankle and knee. So essentially the hand and foot.
Okay.
So normally the lower leg corresponds to the upper finger and the head to the lower finger. And again, inversion is at play here, so the upper finger might correspond to the lower leg. And then the atlas also shows small taiji C in figure T7, and that one specifically shows the correspondence between the head and the sole of the foot.
It's pretty crazy how these different parts of the body are represented in so many different ways within the body itself.
Mm-hmm.
So that was image correspondence, using these visual and structural similarities. But then there's the second key principle, channel correspondence. What's that all about?
Right. So channel correspondence is all about selecting points based on the connections between Tung's points and the traditional Chinese meridian system.
Yeah.
And so meridians are those invisible pathways of energy throughout the body, which are fundamental in Chinese medicine.
Yeah.
And the idea here is that disease channels can actually be treated by using points located on the same channel, maybe a distant point or on a related one.
So someone has like a problem along, let's say, the lung meridian. A Tung's practitioner might not necessarily needle right on that lung meridian in the affected area.
That's right. They might choose a Tung's point that specifically connects to the lung meridian, even if it's somewhere else entirely in the body. And the atlas actually talks about several different types of channel correspondence. So one is same name channel correspondence, where you use points on channels that share the same name. So like the hand taiyang, which is the small intestine meridian, and then the foot taiyang, which is the bladder meridian. So you can use those to treat related conditions, even if they're on opposite sides of the body.
Oh, wow. So that emphasizes just how interconnected everything is.
Yeah. Exactly. And then there's exterior-interior corresponding channel, where you use points on channel pairs that have that exterior-interior relationship in traditional Chinese medicine, so like the lung and large intestine channels, for example.
So a problem with the lungs could be addressed by needling a point related to the large intestine and vice versa.
That's right, yeah. It's like these channels are always in communication.
Wow, that's so cool.
Yeah, and then the atlas also talks about branching and connecting channel correspondence, so that's also known as Wu Zhang Bai Tong. And this one gets into this really intricate network of connections between different channels and organs. And figures T8 and T9 in the atlas actually show these pairings really nicely. So it shows how like the bladder is paired with the lung and the gallbladder with the heart and the stomach with the pericardium. And so points can be selected based on those deeper connections within that energetic web.
It's like a whole web of energy pathways that need to be navigated, like a map of the body's internal communication system or something.
It is, yeah, in a way. And there's actually two more types of channel correspondence that I want to mention. There's channel clock opposite correspondence, where you use points on channels that are opposite each other on the meridian clock. So that's the cyclical flow of qi, the vital energy through the meridians. And then lastly, there's channel clock yin-yang neighbors correspondence, where you're selecting points on yin and yang channels that are next to each other in that meridian clock sequence. And table 2 in the atlas actually has a great summary of all the different types of channel correspondences.
So that's a lot to think about when choosing a point. It's definitely not just about treating the symptoms directly. So we've talked about image correspondence and channel correspondence, but what's that third principle? Tissue correspondence.
Right. So tissue correspondence takes a different approach. So it focuses on treating diseases that affect specific types of tissue in the body. So things like the skin, flesh, sinews, bones, and vessels. And you treat those by needling points that influence those same layers of tissue in a corresponding area.
So it's about targeting the tissue itself, but not necessarily where the problem is.
Yeah, exactly. So figure T10 in the atlas shows this concept, showing the different depths that needling needs to go to reach the various tissue layers. So for example, if you do a really shallow insertion, you might be mainly targeting the skin.
Oh.
Whereas if you go deeper, you could reach the sinews or even the bone. And so the idea is that by needling to a specific depth in one area, you can actually influence the corresponding layer of tissue in the area that's actually diseased. And figure T11 also shows this in relation to small taiji, showing how different needling depths on the hand or foot can target different tissues that correspond to other parts of the body.
So you're not just stimulating a point, you're specifically targeting a layer of tissue in a far-off location. That's crazy.
Exactly.
So to kind of see how these principles might work in practice, can we look at a specific example? What about Zone 1 in Tung's acupuncture?
Yeah, that's a great
So
example.
Zone 1 is those points located on the fingers, right?
Yeah, right. Yep. Points 11.01 through 11.27, according to the Alice.
Wow. That such a small area can have so much power therapeutically is pretty amazing.
Yeah, it really is. And zone 1 shows how image, channel, and tissue correspondence can all work together. So let's take a few examples. So point 11.01, which is also known as Dajian, or big distance, is located on the thumb. And according to the text, the indications for this point include things like heart disease, knee pain, and even hernia.
That's such a wide range of issues. I mean, how does correspondence explain that? It's like it challenges how we normally think about the body. What's the thinking behind those distant connections being so powerful?
Right. So if we consider large taiji, the thumb can correspond to the head and other parts of the body. So a point on the thumb might be able to influence areas further down, like the knee. And also, when we think about channel correspondence, points on the thumb can connect to different meridians that might be involved in things like heart issues or the energy imbalances that are associated with hernia.
Interesting. So what's another example from Zone 1?
So another one is point 11.07, Zisima, or finger rapid horses on the index finger. And the indications for this point include things like chest pain, pleurisy, and rhinitis.
So different conditions again. How does a point on the index finger even relate to the chest and the nose?
Right, so channel correspondence is likely a key factor here. So the meridians that run through the index finger, they have connections to the chest and the respiratory system, which could explain why it's used for chest pain and pleurisy. And then the connection to the lung meridian might also explain why it's used for rhinitis. So again, it shows how these energy pathways link up these seemingly separate areas.
Yeah, I'm starting to see how the point's location on the finger could relate to those other areas. What's one more?
Sure. So point 11.14, Sanzuo, or three weights, is found on the middle finger. And the atlas says that it can be used for things like asthma, knee pain, and arthritis.
Knee pain again. It seems like a lot of points on the fingers are used for knee pain. So instead of focusing on the knee itself, Tun's acupuncture is suggesting that we look at the fingers.
Exactly. So again, this could be related to large taiji with the middle finger corresponding to the lower extremities. But medium taiji could also be at play here as well. And depending on the specific location and how deep you needle sanzuo, tissue correspondence could also be a factor because it can address the tissues in the joints that are affected by knee pain and arthritis. So it's often a combination of these principles at work.
Okay, that's pretty fascinating. And what about point 11.24, Fu K, which means gynecology, which is also on the thumb? Unsurprisingly, this one's indicated for gynecological conditions.
Right, yep. So small taiji is likely at play here. So specific areas on the thumb can correspond to the pelvic region and the reproductive organs. So it's a more localized correspondence.
It's really interesting how such small areas on the fingers can treat such a wide range of conditions using these principles of correspondence. It really shows how Tung's acupuncture sees the body as this interconnected system, constantly referring to itself.
Absolutely, and that's what makes it so unique. Those three core principles, image, channel, and tissue correspondence, they make up this really powerful framework for understanding how to select points in Tung's acupuncture.
Yeah, it really is a different way of thinking about the body. So just to recap, Tung's acupuncture is distinct from traditional Chinese medicine. And to understand it, you need to understand these three ways that practitioners choose their points. So first, they're finding a visual or functional similarity somewhere else in the body, which is image correspondence. Second, they're working with the meridian system, channel correspondence. And third, they're focusing on specific layers of tissue correspondence.
Right, exactly. And what's really amazing is that these principles often allow for distal point selection. So you can treat a condition in one part of the body by needling an area that seems totally unrelated, all because of these really complex and sometimes unexpected correspondences.
It really makes you think about the body's own wisdom, its capacity for healing.
Yeah.
So given all of these systems of correspondence, what other seemingly unconnected parts of the body could have these therapeutic relationships? And how can we use these connections to deepen our understanding of health and well-being? That's something to think about as we wrap up our deep dive into Tung's acupuncture. Thanks for joining us.